So hello, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. I am super pumped about this panel. I think it's it's definitely a big hot topic in Web3, but I go as far as saying it's a big hot topic in science and the world period. I think the last month
Scott, can I ask you to turn up your volume a tiny bit or speak a tiny bit louder, please?
Sure, I'll do that.
Thank you.
So anyway, I guess without further ado, we'll go around the panel and ask everyone to give a little quick intro. I guess Ryan, we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a part of CityDAO, and I do a little work for DeSci World as well as my colleagues.
Sorry, is anybody else getting that is a little bit garbled?
I love the sound, but unfortunately you can't hear the language.
Right. So just to let everybody know, by the way, for anybody just jumping in, this is our second panel at the CityDAO Academic Conference. And the topic of this panel is decentralized science, or DeSci. This will be a 1-hour panel. So Ryan, again, please.
Sorry about the audio issue. Better now? And yeah, so I'm a part of CityDAO as well as DeSci World. And yeah, I've got a couple of my colleagues here as well. And I'll keep it short so everyone can speak.
So you go with your Carolina. Do you want to give us an intro?
Yes, hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carolina from DeSci World also. I work with Ryan and Felisa, and I am a biologist from Uruguay. So thank you so much for your invitation to this panel.
Felisa?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Talissa. I am also part of the core team at DeSci World. I'm also a biologist by trade. I'm looking forward to chatting with you all today.
Rob?
Hi, I'm Rob Skiff. I'm the co-founder and CEO of 3852 AI. We are interested in we use predictive artificial intelligence and robotics to repurpose generic drugs to develop combination drug treatments for breast and ovarian cancer. And I'm really interested in tapping into the DeSci community for two reasons. One is to help us raise funds to run the experiments, okay, to find these combination drug treatments. We've already built the AI and the robotic system. But also to return funds through a co-development license and profit sharing agreement to DAOs and other investors in the form of some type of smart contract.
And finally, Jonathan, go ahead.
Hey guys, my name is Jonathan, or John. I work with several organizations or blockchains in the space. DeSci Labs, Scurf, Gridcoin, the Science Commons Initiative, and Boink, to name a few. I'm very excited for this discussion because DeSci is a lot of fun. I've been in the crypto space for about 10 years at this point, and DeSci, as it's been emerging, reminds me of what crypto was like way back when. We're talking about ways to use this technology to make the world a better place for everyone by changing a fundamental system that really runs the way a lot of the world works. So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, it's just by far easily one of the most exciting areas in Web3. And I think possible application of blockchain technology to science is, I don't think it's on a lot of people's radar, but I truly think it's going to change science big time. So, I mean, interesting thing is like for a lot of things, you can kind of dive right in, you're more sort of easily relatable. But for DeSci, I think a lot of people honestly have a straight up question. What is DeSci? So it's a pretty fundamental question. And maybe if people have the same answer, we don't have to go to everybody. But I'd like to hear from somebody who just define. Maybe Ryan, you can start. What is DeSci?
Sure, it's that very important question. So DeSci stands for decentralized science. And right now we're kind of we're at some early stage, we're not really sure. So to maybe use an analogy, it's kind of like thinking about flight. It's like, are we sort of the Wright brothers figuring out how to make this thing fly? Or maybe even possibly earlier, you know, it's like, are we in the blimp stage? Not really sure, but again, I think that generally speaking, there's certain tools, you know, we're using cryptographic tools. Most sort of like DeSci projects are housed within these things we're calling DAOs, and it's like, that's a whole nother can of worms. Are we going to define DAO? But I think at a very basic level, it's people, many of them scientists themselves, also people who are not practicing scientists, but they're interested in science, that are coming together, and they are trying to approach certain problems found in traditional science. And I know that's very, very broad, but that's kind of the state we're in. It's so early, it's very difficult to pin it down, but I'm super excited, and I'm sure that there's other people on this panel who have other thoughts as well.
Yeah, I'd love to narrow in the definition a little bit, because I think that is a perfect overview of it. It's people, some scientists, some non-scientists, everyone interested in science in general, trying to make it better for everyone. It's definitely a genre of crypto that is using distributed ledger technology to soften, redesign, or remove the gatekeeper or middleman structures in the system of science. That's what this technology is built to do from the get-go. Get rid of the middlemen, right? And when you do that in science, you end up changing, or at least having the potential to change almost every aspect of how the system works. You can change how data and knowledge is created. You can change how reproducibility works. You can change how impact factors work. You can change how people get credit for their research, how they're accredited as researchers, how they gain reputation, how they get funding, how they publish their findings, how peer review happens, how intellectual property works, and at the fundamental level, how people get access to resources. So whether that's funding or like computational cycles, or even wet lab resources like chemicals, there is so much that can be done using the tools of distributed ledger technology through these DeSci mechanisms that we're building to democratize science and make it accessible to everyone. So for me, that's what DeSci means. And for anyone who's getting into crypto, I would highly recommend they jump into the DeSci ecosystem and try and help out, find a project, whether it's a DAO or not, and try and contribute however they can.
Scott, you're muted.
Those are great definitions. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Looks
Sure,
like
Tippy.
No, I'm just curious. Sorry, I'm just curious about how to get involved with these side projects. Will's asking my question right now, like as a maybe someone with a psychology background or generic experience. Is there a way to get involved in a way that's like builds ownership or has incentives, or is it just like come on in and work for free and hopefully we'll all make it kind of?
I can kind of talk about how we're thinking of this, co-ownership piece. When Jonathan was talking about blowing up gatekeepers, he's absolutely right. There's not the funding mechanisms for science, for really cutting edge science, is kind of one thing: get grants or go to VC, and neither of which actually serves the interests of pushing forth, developing new therapies, new kinds of basic science and research. And so we're talking with people. We're at the beginning stages. I mean, we have our legal structure, how we're going to structure the co-licensing agreement. We have, we know that we're going to have to, it's going to have to be a smart contract. We know that there's going to have to be, accredited investors involved. There's also the ability within a protocol of a smart contract to also give stake to people who are contributing via their ideas or their marketing or their network. So I think that whatever systems that get created, you know, specifically in our project, we've got to make sure that the non-scientists who are reaching out, they get a piece of the pie too. And that's why I really like this whole DeSci smart contract DAO, you know, using that as a potential investment vehicle, because you can spread the capital and the benefit, not just to the whales, but to the people who are actually not in those categories, so that they can benefit from an ROI, a return on their investment. Plus, you know, selfishly, we also need to make sure that the DAOs have capital to pursue their projects, like the university that we talked about in the last session. You know, we think that, well, we don't think, we know based on our research that we're going to get, you know, that there's going to be significant economic return. If DAOs can start to get a great capital return on other particular projects, not necessarily just NFTs, that's going to really push the adoption of DAOs across society. And that's super, super important.
Yeah, Rob, I completely agree with you, especially on the points of bringing sort of the access to science to people who are outside of science. So the artists and everyone who's involved in building this stuff on a more individual level. To, if you want to get involved with DeSci, I would love to hear from the folks from DeSci World who are here right now about this. But there are, to a point that was made earlier, it's still a very young space. So a lot of these things are still getting built, but there are a bunch of project aggregation tools, DeSci World being one of them. The Science Commons Initiative is also trying to do some stuff in this arena, where you can go in and you can find all the different DeSci projects that exist right now, or, you know, we're doing the best we can to list them all. Some of them are DAOs, some of them are straight up companies like Web2's type companies. But you bring your skill set, you get involved however you can, and some of them do have things like bounty boards, or, you know, if you demonstrate your passion and your enthusiasm, they might just straight up hire you. And at the end of the day, this is all built on blockchain philosophy, which is rooted in stakeholder concepts. So if you're part of a network, you're kind of incentivized to help establish that network and make it grow. So on an individual level, again, and I would love to hear from DeSci World, just find a project out there that you connect with. I know there are some psych projects, and just get in there and see if there's any funding they have for anything you want to do to contribute to that project.
Yeah, I'm going to drop a few links in the chat, because I, way back when, before DeSci World and all of this, I onboarded into DeSci myself. So it was a big kind of navigation through what the current ecosystem was and trying to figure out how the community operated. But now I think there's so many good resources for individuals who are just simply interested in figuring out what DeSci does, like what the DeSci community is about. So obviously I plug our DeSci World dashboard. We are aggregating projects within the space, and we have a lot of emphasis on making sure that a diverse range of projects are displayed from the DeSci community. And then I also link the DeSci Wiki and the DeSci D-Work platform. So those are definitely resources that I would suggest checking out as an individual.
Yeah, if you haven't checked out the D-Work DeSci Hub, definitely do. There's a lot of small tasks. You can get like $5 or $10 for contributing, or there's some that are like $1,000 bounties out there. It's a huge resource. I love it.
Hey, do you listen to me? Yes. Okay, no, just I wanted to add to the DeSci definition that Ryan and also the other, sorry, I didn't read your name, said about DeSci. I wanted to say that I think that one of the most important things about DeSci movement is like it's promoting the idea of science as a public good. So in that sense, we're like saying to people that we need help, that they can participate directly in the scientific process, like engaging in DAOs or giving funds to projects that have low funding, but are of the community interest. So I think it's very important that we stay like a fundamental mission of DeSci. It's like involving all the community in the scientific process, not only scientists, which is I think is very interesting of our movement. And as Talisa, I entered DeSci like by myself and started digging in the web space and learning about projects and learning about what people was doing in the space. So I think that DeSci World has this, it's like a very important gateway for people to enter in the DeSci space.
I think that's a huge point. The getting people involved in science like that, I don't think we can overstress how important that is, because for so long science has been reserved for academia, and then the public just needs to deal with whatever academia produces. We need to reconnect those two realms so that people trust science and scientists trust the public too. Like there's a give and take for both arenas.
Yeah. And people get involved in what kind of science they want to see build and what kind of research they want to see funded. For example, you perhaps I just stand perhaps from I am a biologist and I work for a nonprofit, but I'm also a mom. So I imagine that perhaps I have a daughter that have a rare disease that nobody is investigated. It's fortunately, it's not my case, but I know that lots of people have their kids with rare diseases and nobody is investigate that diseases because there is no enough funds for that because it's rare. So it's not like nobody is producing therapies or medicines to avoid that situation because they are rare. But for that people, they now have the chance to gather themselves into a DAO and try to fund research directly towards this kind of situations. It's like we are scientists, like now we have the opportunity to build these bridges between science and the community and assess these kind of situations. That's why I am also very excited about DeSci, and I think it's like we are now in this growing moment of expansion, and I think it's very promising.
Yeah, I think that you're hitting on a lot of important stuff too, like the patient-specific projects. I know of a bunch in the space, so if anyone's interested in that stuff, definitely get involved. And to add on that, this actually goes back to what we were talking about before the recording started with regards to this morning's talks on how like academia is sort of this ivory tower, if you're familiar with the concept, but basically there's this campus that's really well manicured and it's got all these big buildings where you go to do research. Not everyone has access to that, especially as the world develops and a whole bunch more of people want to do science. Like not everyone is going to be able to go to a university. So DeSci gives us the tools perhaps to invite a massive amount of people into the scientific system and just discover new stuff at a much faster rate because people are here doing science.
Jonathan's absolutely right. I mean, we've noticed it in a huge way with the rise of what are called contract research organizations and the robotic workflows that they've created that can help drug discovery and development. When 3 years ago, when we were fiddling with the idea of finding a combination drug treatment that works for breast cancer. And so, and it's a combination treatment of 7 to 8 generic drugs that we're repurposing, and they work synergistically to attack cancer from, many, many different directions. It was going to cost 120 million to find that treatment using animal models. Well, fast forward, and we can come up with a combination drug treatment to treat certain kinds of metastatic breast cancer at a discovery. So using cell line assays, we can find those for about 5 million now. We can find them because we don't have to invest in the infrastructure of a huge lab. We can contract out the experiments we want to run per generation to another to another group. And so the need to invest in large infrastructure, which previously only big pharma could do, is now being democratized. And there's kind of like an inverse, Moore's law. The cost per experiment is dramatically falling, and that's going to open up more space for more innovation. And that force, combined with the destruction of the gatekeeping function of venture capital, okay, which we can talk about maybe later, but is huge. The fact that, individuals and DAOs, I mean, you guys are sitting on an incredible amount of capital with your Ethereum stakes, your Bitcoin, different kinds of other NFTs, et cetera. You're sitting on incredible capital. And the question is, where do you want to deploy it? And the DeSci is going to be an area, I think, where there's going to be a huge revolution in terms of who's actually funding the next generation of amazing companies and amazing technologies. I think it can come from DeSci and groups like CityDAO, et cetera.
Yeah, that's great. Reminds me, there's this kind of depressing saying, science progresses when you give it a lot of time. The sad dark humor behind it is that certain foundations or whatever suck up so much funding, and it's just really, it's so gated and it works like that. It's not this really open model. Unfortunately, it takes till something happens for someone to give funding. And I think this DeSci is so powerful because it just gives everyone a route to fund things they can fund. They don't have to go through traditional routes and stuff.
And let me just also add in the fact that the infrastructure needed to create a smart contract or to create a DAO, that the barrier to entry, so there are a couple of issues that we have to deal with. One is making sure that people who are going to invest in a license are either accredited investors or following all the securities law, okay? That's hugely important for us as a company located in the US and in Europe. And the second thing is to make sure that the contract that we sign is legally enforceable. And there are some really cool companies that are working on those particular issues, like Radix is creating platform. There are other particular platforms that are doing this. And so it's making, like, I'm not a blockchain distributed ledger expert at all. I know enough to get myself into a lot of trouble. Okay, that's it. But there are people that we can talk to and we can connect with who can make sure that the wallets are secure, make sure that the capital flow, that the contracts are secure, make sure that when we get that check from that pharma company back into us for anywhere from 150 to 300 million for that ovarian cancer treatment we want to throw up on this smart contract in DAO, that those capital flows go straight back to the people who have invested in it. And that type of infrastructure is really, really important to close the loop between the intellectual property that people are developing in DeSci and the capital that people are investing, both in terms of capital, and I mean that in the broadest term, in terms of time, in terms of NFTs or assets or resources, so that everybody gets to benefit from these amazing new treatments / new insights that are happening, and most especially the scientists themselves. That's a really big deal, and a lot of a lot of biologists, a lot of physicists, a lot of AI people are not getting the returns. It's kind of exploited labor, for lack of a better word, and that has to change too. Enough of my
I think you just it's value extraction. I think you just hit a huge definition point of DeSci that we completely glossed over. The whole point of it is to return value creation and capture back to the stakeholders of the system. So the scientists and the PhD candidates, they should all be profiting from the work that they do. They should be getting paid. They shouldn't
Amen.
be doing essentially like intern work for changing people's lives. And then the public is part of the stakeholder. They're arguably the largest stakeholder in the outcomes of science, because it doesn't matter that they live with the outcomes of science no matter what. They don't have a choice. Someone created the ability to split the atom, and they have to live with nuclear power and the atom bomb. So it's about bringing value back, giving the power back to the actual stakeholders, and not just these gatekeepers, not just the siloed publishers and the funders. And although in the defense of the funders, they do, I think a lot of people who fund science nowadays do understand the importance of open access and open science, which DeSci is built on. In the US, we just had the law that all federally funded science has to be open access. That was just passed like last week. And there's these things called FAIR principles now, which is all about reproducibility and all this stuff. But Rob, you also brought up another point that I'm curious if anyone else has an opinion on, having to do with intellectual property. Because I know that's a huge pillar of the legacy system. I'm just curious if anyone thinks, or what people think about intellectual property in a world of distributed ledgers. Like, does it even need to exist, or is it going to exist in a different way?
Can I just take an initial stab at that one, and then I'll stop talking because I don't want to talk too much. The IP issues have to be really specific to the area that you're dealing with. So, for example, I don't think IP goes away because there are really, really bright people who are creating AI algorithms, or groups of people who are creating AI algorithms, who are doing the job of cultural capital production. They need to be able to benefit from their work, include scientists especially. And what we have to do, I think, Jonathan, is get rid of those gatekeepers. And in my mind, the gatekeepers right now are venture capital is a huge gatekeeper. The universities are huge gatekeepers in terms of how they tie up the IP of their research scientists. And also big pharma, in terms of the way they've structured, the way they do their deal structures, is a huge issue. And I think that the blockchain distributed ledger, if we can cut out as many layers of the, first things first, let's slay the VC beast. Okay. Let's get them as much out of the game as possible. And then let's empower the scientists and the people actually doing this work to get more benefit. And I think when we eliminate the VC piece, we'll start to see those capital flows going to the scientists and the creators of the tech.
Yeah, on that point, Jonathan, I think it's an interesting question. It's super complex, and you're going to get all kinds of different answers depending on who you're talking to. Namely, if you're talking to a lawyer, I'm pretty sure,
Good example.
We are, especially from an American perspective, we're hyper litigious. Maybe we're the most litigious society ever. I don't know. But from my perspective, as someone who's not a lawyer, I feel like the tools that are being developed will dissolve some of this discussion, because the reality is going to be, what can people do? And we already see this with IP law. We see China not respecting American IP law every day, and other countries, and vice versa. In America, you see it go both ways. And so and again, this question of like IP when it comes to the ledger technology, there are private ledgers that have been created. So it's what are we doing with all this data? And also when it comes to like genetic data, if it's untampered, and again, I'm not an expert, but it's my understanding that if you as a US citizen, you can't sell it, but you can put it into a repository, and then that company like 23andMe can sell it. There's also smaller crypto-based projects that are trying to disrupt this model, but there's just a lot of funny business in my mind when it comes to what are individuals allowed to sell, what kind of data, what can they do with that data. I mean, in the United States, you can sell human eggs but you can't sell human organs. You can't sell your kidney, but there are, in Iran, you can. So that's, to my knowledge, it's the only country in the world with a market for kidneys. And again, as an American, it's very difficult to get clear-cut information on how all that system works. But I just feel like you're going to see huge amounts of disruption when it comes to these legal questions, because these tools are just going to allow people to do certain things that they couldn't do before. And then the question of who gets to enforce this, how, I mean, all these questions are coming up too with DAOs. It's like, where do you incorporate? I mean, it's not clear in my mind at all where the best place to incorporate is, let alone how do you even start to sort of equate these things. And the other thing too about the DeSci movement, which I think is going to be massively disruptive as well, is, again, this is personal opinion, but I just feel like there's many people with certain jobs, and the reason largely that they have those jobs, and it's not to say that there's tons of hardworking people. It's you have to struggle no matter where you live, but certain places it's a lot easier than others, and we have certain institutions and things, and we have this massive asymmetric position in a place like the United States that keeps a lot of people out, and you have to go through these giant barriers to get in. And you're going to see that with the way that science is conducted. As we have these models of education. It's traditionally you gather people by the same age. Yes, there's a little wiggle room with that, but it's like, does it make sense that the traditional BA is based on a time system? And yeah, you can game it a bit, but traditionally the majority of people, it's based on a time system. And then you throw in asynchronous ways of learning and just these different models. And I just feel like it's right for disruption. And so, I mean, I think it's exciting. I think there's going to be all sorts of new problems as well that we're going to have to face. But again, I know I'm a bit of a ramble there, but I'll stop.
I think it's good. I definitely have a response, but Carolina or Talissa, do you have any thoughts?
I will just put in my 2 cents too, coming from within academia myself. I'm currently a PhD candidate, so I deal with academia on a daily basis, and it's exactly as DeSci paints it out to be. We see all of these sentiments on Twitter and other platforms, like people are leaving academia because there's so little opportunity within the space to sort of expand what we are as scientists, or even just do science that we want to do, right? Without the burden of these elite funding institutions, without these like weird hierarchies of veteranship and things like that. So, on this note, like from a personal standpoint, the reason I think got so pulled into DeSci initially is because it felt like the most tangible way to actually shift the narrative of science as we know it, and bring it back to this sort of practice that anyone can participate in, because it is something that we all participate in on a daily basis, and it affects all of us inevitably, right? So I think when it comes to quality of life for current researchers, and also better engagement between the public and scientists, the scientific institution, DeSci proved to be the most reliable method to kind of unleash this relationship. And I think what everyone is talking about, whether it be very specific about these different projects that are happening within the space, or just like the general ethos of the space, I think it all is starting to align as the community grows. But as Ryan said, and we talk about this a lot within the DeSci world, like team, is that we are lacking some criticism and some self-reflection of the community. I think we are in our echo chamber right now, and so it's really valuable, I think, to have these interdisciplinary opinions and conversations like this that really open up the DeSci community to other disciplines and other groups of people.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's a statistic out there. I wish I could remember it off the top of my head, but like the number of PhD candidates that end up just like doing something completely different because there's not enough room in our society for all these scientists. It's crazy. But to going back to IP really quick, Ryan, what you said with regards to like a lot of these discussions might just dissolve. I love that idea, because it's like I think we go back to the idea of what is the purpose of IP, which is to make sure that whoever developed a thing gets credit and paid for their work. When you have this distributed ledger, you might be able to just publish like your research as you produce it. You can do a micro publication, and if your micro publication ever turns into a translatable product that produces income for whoever translates it, there's that provenance where it's very transparent and clear that that product came from your basic research. So that income for that translated project might trickle some back into you as a basic researcher. An example I like to use for this is like Einstein and Verizon Wireless, like the cell phone company. Einstein makes theory of general relativity, which is used to create GPS, which the cell phone companies use to make a buttload of money. So if we had blockchain back when he did the theories, maybe he's getting some payment for doing that basic research, all without intellectual property at all. It just seems like the things we can do with these tools are mind-blowing, and we haven't even begun to scratch the surface.
Yeah, I think the topic of intellectual property is so big, and I don't think people realize how bizarre it is in many ways. Like in science, essentially, how do you get your intellectual property? Is you could do a decade of research. You don't really own it until it's published in your name. And I mean, to say, but the blockchain to me has so much potential because you could, in theory, you could every second you could update your results. If it's on an NFT, you can literally update constantly. So Jonathan, you mentioned the word provenance, which is huge. You have ownership every second. There's no issue of whose intellectual property is. It just makes science so much more open and less guarded, less secrecy. I don't think people imagine how much secrecy there actually is in science. But anyway, if anyone wants to have anything to add to that, I'd love to hear.
That's a huge aspect. I'm talking a lot. Someone can feel free to cut me off whenever you want. But the idea of secrecy, of not publishing your research as you're producing your research, waiting until you're completely done to publish it, like that screws up so much. Like you have people doing the same research in parallel when they could just be collaborating. But because there's this secrecy and you want to own your research until you're done with it, they don't collaborate. If you can prove ownership of data produced or of research, of outcomes or of method even, just by posting it and time stamping it on a blockchain, just imagine the amount of collaboration that come about from that. Like you can, one of the organizations I'm working with is building these things called research objects, which are just like a GitHub repo as mentioned in the chat. And you can submit your object, someone else can come in and like essentially make a pull request on that object, add to it, someone else can come in and add a little bit to it, and you just kind of work together to produce an outcome that benefits society. It sounds so great, and it's a shame we don't do it in the world today.
I'm curious, Talisa, you just said you were in the process, I guess, of doing research. Does that, would that be a huge in your field? I would think it would be.
So on a data, I'm a microbiologist, micromolecular. So I deal with a lot of high throughput data, right? And having open access to a lot of these things is really beneficial. But then also on the other end, because the project I'm working on is under this huge NIH grant, I don't know the future of like, once I leave this project, once I graduate and finish up, what is belonging to me and what doesn't, right? So the data and stuff gets pushed to open access, things like that, because it deals with a big environmental kind of data set. But the actual intellectual property of the research itself, I don't know. I'm also within like a pretty complex or like big university system that tends to take a lot of credit and funding and property from its researchers. So I haven't really explored what that looks like for me personally in my position, but from a DeSci standpoint, I think it's really, I see both sides, right? I see that it's really appealing to have intellectual property written on chain, and being able to own exactly what you do. But at the same time, I do really think the openness is something that we might be able to, well, the openness is something that's also very appealing, right? But at the same time, it kind of goes into this weird territory of data ethics and things like that. Like having open access to everything all the time, is that necessarily something that we want to put into the hands of like a big community and the world potentially, right? I love the IP debate in DeSci. I feel like it's one of the big and only like good, solid, like back and forths that happen in the space. So, you know, I like hearing both sides. I don't know if I have a solid opinion for myself yet, though.
The graduate students, you know, at the university, I've studied and been involved in tech transfer. It's not a great system because the universities are counting on the technology that they develop internally to license and to make money for their endowments, et cetera, and their infrastructure. It's really difficult. It depends on the university you're at, what kind of rights you're going to have potentially to any of the IP that you create. The default is generally that you have none. And so I think that's why there's the overarching theory of we want open IP for everywhere, and that's a position. But I think that we've got to bound what we're trying to do in sort of like in our own individual projects. I don't think we're going to come up with a solution that's going to be universal for everybody. I think what we've got to do is, you know, we pick the projects that we pick, and what we have to do is default to try to get something into that open source, you know, DeSci community. Whatever it is we can, what can we get there? What can we get there legally? What can we get there that creates some sort of feedback loop of resources that's going to strengthen the DeSci community so it functions better? So whether that's publication of an article that you're doing as a graduate student on the blockchain, and so that it's out there rather than be behind a paywall, that's a great thing. If you're in the position of you're developing a novel technology, you know, how can you structure it so that a DAO is going to get some resources from that? And then work it that way, because I just think that the issues in every single discipline and at every single position where different people are at in the hierarchy are so complex that the only thing we can be guided by is how can we create more social, political, cultural, intellectual capital to DAOs in the DeSci community, and do that as the default.
I just wanted to say,
So amazingly,
sorry, these topics are super important, and we're going to be struggling with them for a while. But one of the reasons why I find DeSci so appealing is it allows people to interact with scientists in a way that is kind of impossible. You know, I've interacted with more scientists in the last couple of months than I have my entire life. You know, I don't have a scientific background, but I think it's super important to engage with what's happening in science. We've seen with COVID, you know, there's nowhere to hide. It's global. It's affecting everyone. But that's not the only thing. There's massive environmental issues. There's all kinds of tools, specifically in AI, in my mind, with the rise of things like DALL-E and different permutations of that are just going to be. It's going to make it people allowed to do things that have never really been possible. But also, you know, things like TikTok, and you know, you see the spread of these memes that start online, but then they start to bleed into the real world. Just the other day, I saw a kid digging a massive hole in the beach, and it's a meme on TikTok to dig massive holes. And you might say, okay, they're just digging a big hole at the beach. But then it becomes a problem, because then it's like you have a big hole at the beach and no one's putting the sand back. And it's just like, and also it's like, how are collectively hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people, focusing their time, and how are they being manipulated? But again, I would love to hear Carolina speak to her particular kind of research and her perspective, because she does have a very interesting, I think, viewpoint on sort of how science is conducted. But I'll let her speak on that.
So yes, I was thinking about the IP discussion you were having, and I endorsed Alicia's what she said, and I'm on the same page. I myself don't have a solid opinion on that. I see both sides. I think we must work to find something that would be in between. What I am most, regarding the scientific process, and which is that we know that as scientists that the publishing system is influencing directly the funding system, because if you don't have funds, you can't publish. But if you don't have papers, you have no funding, because nobody is going to fund basic or innovating research. So it's kind of difficult from that perspective. And I think that regarding the IP, or perhaps the first things that you said, like the possibility of publishing something like an initial, it's like a manuscript or something, like, okay, we are in these early stages of research, and I did this, which is very basic, but it's like I'm standing from this point, and perhaps like having this opportunity of showing the early stages of your work, which no traditional journal will publish that. You may want to, or you may have the opportunity to engage more people to your work, gain visibility, and also apply for different fundings, which is very important. And mostly if you like myself, like I belong to an independent scientific group and in a non-profit. We are outside university, because in the university here, there's no any specific lab for cetacean ecology. So we are like on ourselves, which is very difficult to keep like in that publishing racing, because when you apply to a grant or something, they expect that you have papers, but to have papers or to do the research, you need money. So it's like this vicious cycle. And maybe through the IP thing, and through also the, I think it's related, the reputation system would be interesting, because that would enhance like traceability of papers, which is something that I'm always thinking about. Mostly if you have like a common surname, you can publish. And as far as I know, the only system that has some things in that something similar to what I'm saying is ResearchGate. When people, then you publish your papers and your investigations, and you gain some sort of how to say, score calculated based on how many people read your papers, or how many people shared your papers, or in which discussion you engaged. And when you publish your paper there and you mention the co-authors, it's very common that ResearchGate emails you back and ask you, is this person the same one that published this other paper? And it relies on your trust on a third person to say it is or it's not. And I think that through the publishing processes and the IP discussion and all the new tools that we can develop using blockchain, perhaps we can also solve that question, that thing that is very would be very, very important to solve.
I think bringing up ResearchGate is a great example of Web 2 trying to push open science to the next world, right? Because they did it's like social media for research for scientists. I talked to someone who was involved with that the early days, and like he brought up how enthusiastic they were about what ResearchGate was going to do. It's going to fix science. It's going to change the reputation system. It's going to make it open again. And then, you know, a couple years later, they realized, well, you know, we did some good, but it didn't really work. And this goes back to what Talissa was saying with DeSci. Like, we are all very enthusiastic about what these tools can do, but there needs to be pushback against that enthusiasm, sort of bring it down to reality. Like, we might not solve everything. There's a lot that we don't know. There's a lot of, at the very least, time that this is going to take to develop, like decades for this maybe to play out. So for people who might be listening to this, like, these guys are crazy, how are they going to do all this? Come in, we want to hear what you have to say. We want you to tell us we're crazy and change the way we're asking the questions on how we're going to use these tools to make science more democratic and open for everyone.
Yeah, it's the same thing as the open source movement. So I think it's very important, that movement, but they haven't expand or solve the problem because they were using the same system. It's like, so you want to publish a paper which is open source, so everyone can read that paper, but the journals, like, they charge a lot of money to do that. So you end up publishing the other way, and then you try to send your paper if somebody writes an email to you, but it's not necessarily working in that way. So I think that maybe we can address that issue too. But I agree with you that maybe we are very enthusiastic or whatever, but I think that we are just starting, and all these discussions and panels and people talking. And what's most important to me is that I realized that there's a lot of problems that are, you know, common to everyone, no matter where the part of the world you are. And that's the proof that we need, that we are like in a moment that is very important. And if we all gather together, we can perhaps solve it, at least for the future generations.
Yeah, that's amazing. I don't know, it's just such a rich topic. I feel like the hour kind of flew by, and we still didn't even really get in depth on some conversations, but there's so much to dig deep on. Personally, I just have so much hope. Like, when you think about the blockchain, and I think Caroline just mentioned, if you're using the same technology, you're not going to solve the problems. But I mean, the blockchain's an open ledger, and science more than anything should be open, right? And there's been this thing called the replication crisis, which turns out pilot research isn't replicable. Just like saying science is having a science crisis, because that's what science will do. If everything's completely open, and literally all the information and everything in your experiments and what you're doing is on the blockchain, by definition should be open and accessible to anybody, and should be reproducible. That'd be incredible. So anyway, just the promise of that is so amazing. With that, we're going to start the next panel, 4 minutes. I want to give everyone a break, but really appreciate you guys. And yeah, I mean, thanks so much. I guess we go right. Do you have any quick last words?
I mean, thank you for putting this together. CityDAO is great. I actually just was introduced to you guys because of this event, and it's a very interesting proposal y'all have, and I'm looking forward to following it. And I think you just hit on one topic that I wish we had more time to go into, which was the incentives of researchers. They're not currently incentivized to reproduce their research. They're just incentivized to, like, cite or publish or whatever. So blockchain is a distributed ledger. It's also programmable money. And with that aspect of blockchain, we can change the reason people do things by giving them money that we get to mint ourselves. It's so exciting.
Yeah, thank you, Scott and David, for putting this on. And I just wanted to say, this whole idea of DeSci, it's super new. We need tons of help, whether you're a scientist or you're not. If you're just curious and you want to learn more, definitely check out DeSci World. And you know, it's something as simple as, do you have an opinion? Do you have questions? Because there's tons of stuff we need to figure out, and we don't have the answers.
Awesome. Well, on that, we'll just change it over. I'll take a quick break and I'll turn it over to Melinda. A couple minutes, we'll have the panel on funding Web3 education. So yeah, thank you guys again so much.
Okay, thanks everybody. That concludes our second panel for the CityDAO Academic Conference on DeSci. Thank you all very much to all the panelists. It was a super engaging discussion, very interesting, lots of great information. I'm going to stop the recording now. Just a second.